Hi, everybody. We're thinking about not chicken, but reading. That's right. It's our cool first chapter time. And I decided this week to do another classic that's been around for many moons, which means a very long time ago. It's called Journey to the Center of the Earth. It's one of those great illustrated classics. So a publisher took a book and kind of rewrote the story a little bit to where it's not as long and added some pictures so your mind can really kind of get into this story. And this is a story that was written by Jules Verne. He was born in France. And he longed to travel to unknown worlds. And at 12, he tried to sneak on a ship bound for India. And but his father pulled him off the ship and gave him a spanking, because they did that in those days. And however, he vowed that he would continue to travel to unknown places, but only in his imagination. And so he came up with this great story. And here we go. Chapter 1, The Great Discovery. You can tell it's an old book. Looking back at all that happened to me since that eventful day, I'm hardly able to believe that my adventures were real. They were so wonderful that even now I'm amazed when I think about them. I was living with my uncle, a German, who was a professor of philosophy, chemistry, geology, mineralogy, and many other ologies. Professor Hardwig, my uncle, had invited me to study under him, for I was greatly interested in learning as much as I could about the earth and what lies under its surface. Although my uncle was a most learned man and could speak with the greats of the scientific world in almost any language, and he could classify 600 different geological specimens by their weight, hardness, sound, taste, and smell, he did not at all look the part. He was 50 years old, tall, thin, and wiry. Large glasses hid his vast, round, bulging eyes. His nose was thin like a file and was constantly being attracted to tobacco. When he walked, he stepped a yard at a time, clenched his fist as if he were going to hit you, and then walked on. At most times, he was far from a pleasant companion. So it kind of reminds me of he's a little bit on the grumpy side. But Professor Hardwig is by no means a bad sort of man. However, to live with him means to obey him. So when he came home one day and began to call, "Harry, Harry, Harry," I hastened to go at once, even though at the time I was more interested in finding out what was being prepared for dinner than what my uncle wanted me for. I took the steps 3 at a time and presented myself to my uncle in his study. My uncle's study was a perfect museum filled with minerals of every kind. When I entered, he was studying a book, not even aware that I had joined him in the room. "Wonderful," he said to himself as he studied the book. "Just wonderful." The book was an old one, yellow with age, just the kind of book my uncle enjoyed the most. "Did you want me for something, Uncle?" I asked. "It is the Heimskringla of Snorre Turleson," he said, "the famous Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is a true account of a Norwegian princess who ruled Iceland." "What language is it in?" I asked, hoping that it would be German, a German translation that I could read, but my uncle would have nothing of translations. Only originals would do. "It is a runic manuscript," he said, "the language of the original population of Iceland," and he was angry at my ignorance. My uncle had picked up the book to show me the strange letters of this language when a scrap of paper fell from between 2 of the yellow pages. My uncle seized the paper like a hungry man snatching at a morsel of bread. It was an ancient parchment, about 3 inches by 5 inches, with strange-looking characters written all over it. "It is runic," my uncle declared, his voice and fingers trembling. I looked at it closely. Little did I know that this small parchment would lead us on one of the most wondrous adventures ever known to man. But while my uncle could read runic, he could not decipher the meaning of the letters on the parchment. Just then, the cook called up for us to eat dinner. I cannot be bothered with dinner, my uncle yelled, but I was hungry and I went to dinner. I was just finishing the last of my dessert and wine when I heard my uncle roaring for me to come at once. I made a leap for the stairs to his study, so loud and fierce was his call. My uncle was sitting, staring at the small piece of parchment. I declare to you that it is runic, he yelled. It contains some wonderful secret that I must get at any cost. And I looked at the letters on the parchment, and they made no sense to me. And this is what the letters looked like. That's runic. And you know what? I know a little bit about runes in Iceland. That's the Vikings. And I like Viking history, so I'm really kind of interested in this book so far. Sit down, my uncle said, and write what I tell you to write. I obeyed at once. Scarcely giving me time to finish taking all the words down, he snatched the paper from my hand and examined it with deep concentration. I should like to know what it means, he said, as much to himself as to me. But I certainly could not tell him. It reminded me of a cryptograph, a puzzle, he said. I may be on the verge of a great discovery. My opinion was that it was all rubbish, and I kept that opinion to myself, as my uncle's anger was not easy to bear. The parchment and the book are written in different hands, he said. The book is about 200 years older than the parchment, so the parchment must have been written by some person who owned the book later than the original owner. So the next question is, who owned the book? On the inside of the cover, my uncle found what at first looked like an ink stain, but on closer inspection, it proved to be a line of the writing almost rubbed away by time, and my uncle studied the letters. And there is the ruins. And there's his uncle. Arnie Saknussemm, my uncle cried in triumph. He owned this book. He was a brilliant Icelandic professor and chemist of the 16th century. It was he who wrote the mysterious words on the parchment, perhaps some astounding discovery of his. My uncle walked around the room in a state of excitement. Until I discover the meaning of those words, he vowed, I will neither eat nor sleep. My dear uncle, I began. Nor will you either, he cried. I was glad that I had just eaten an unusually large meal. My uncle and I tried various languages and various variations of the languages on the letters of the parchment. We worked for hours, but the parchment yielded no clue. My uncle felt certain that Saknussemm had written his message in Latin, as most educated men of the time wrote in Latin, but the order of the letters provided no known Latin words. Then my uncle began reading the puzzling cryptograph all sorts of ways, according to some theory of his own, and he had me write the following. And what he wrote down doesn't even make any kind of sense at all. Strange letters and words, and there's no order, there's no spaces, nothing. And it still made no sense to me. My uncle became enraged. He struck the table with his fist and left the room and the house, slamming the doors behind him as he went. I sat down for a while, relaxing. Then my mind returned to the parchment, and I picked it up again and began to study it. I found a few scattered Latin words, an English word, and several French words. It was enough to drive a man crazy. The heat in the closed room was too much to bear, and I began to fan myself with the parchment. For the first time, I saw both the front and the back of it. Imagine my surprise when, glancing at the back of the parchment, I saw that the ink had gone through, revealing the Latin words crater and earth. And I had discovered the secret. And all I had to do was read the parchment. And all I had to do to read the parchment was to look at it backwards. My eyes were dazzled and my hands trembled with excitement as I began to read. But what horror and shock possessed me as I discovered the terrible secret. It had really been accomplished. A man had actually dared to do what? I immediately made a decision. No living being should know the parchment secret. Never, I cried. Never will my uncle learn this dreadful secret. Well, I wonder what the secret is on the paper. Because he said crater and earth. He would immediately undertake this terrible journey revealed in the message. Nothing would stop him. I could not allow such madness, nor could I take the chance of my uncle discovering the message. I would have to destroy it. I snatched up the book and the parchment and was about to toss them into the fire when my uncle entered the room. He did not even notice what I was about to do as he took the materials from me and began to look at them carefully. My flesh crawled as I realized that he might soon discover the way to read the parchment and its terrible secret. Well, hours went by and I dared not leave the room. I went to the sofa and I fell asleep. When I awoke, my uncle was still at work. His eyes were red, his hair was matted, and his feverish hands were still working. I loved him and truly felt sorry for his suffering, but I could not reveal the terrible secret. He continued to study the parchment as night turned to morning and morning turned to afternoon. At about 2 o'clock, he gave out a yell so loud that I almost fell from the sofa where I was still resting. Backwards, he cried. It is backwards. Oh, how cunning Saknussemm was to begin to translate the parchment. Descend into the crater of Yokel of Sneffels, which the shade of Scartaris carcasses before the cadence of July. Audacious traveler, and you will reach the center of the earth. I did it. Arn, signed Arn Saknubman. These words are kind of hard to read because they're Icelandic, but he translated the message. My uncle leaped 3 feet off the ground, then ran around the room wildly, knocking over the tables and chairs and tossing his book into the air. We start at once, he cried, and you will share in my glory. Start where? I asked, afraid to answer. To the center of the earth. So now I'm thinking, okay, codes and where words come from, and this is a coded message, and how did they figure this out in Latin and German words? So I was thinking about those things while I was reading this first chapter, and so I went out into the library and I found a book that we have called Where Words Come From. It's in our nonfiction section, and I started thinking about systems and patterns. And I looked for the word galaxy. And if you read it, it talks about where this word came from. Well, it says, would you believe the word galaxy actually means a circle of milk? And the reference to the Milky Way galaxy has been around for more than 600 years. And today, galaxy is defined as a system of stars, an assembly of famous people or brilliant array of things. And please do not try to count the number of stars in the galaxy. Your milk might get sour while you are counting. Well, then I was thinking about, okay, if that's what all that means, it's a system of and patterns. Well, that got me to thinking about poetry, because poetry you can write in patterns like the AABB pattern or the ABC pattern or the ABAB pattern. And it is National Poetry Month. April is National Poetry Month. So then I was thinking, ooh, I went to the poetry section and found this great poetry book called The Day the Universe Exploded in My Head. And I love poems and I love the solar system. And in this book, they are going to go to the journey, they're journeying to the center of the Earth, and Earth is a planet in our solar system. And I found this cool poem, and it's got an ABAB pattern. It's called The Sun, And in one part of this poem, it says, I lit the fires that made you what you are. When times were dark, I rose above it all. Next time you want to wish upon a star, you need not even wait for night to fall. And this is a poem from this book called The Sun. And that got me to thinking about superheroes, because superheroes are there when times are dark and they help you rise above it all. And so that what got me thinking about real superheroes. Not like Wonder Woman and Superman and Spider-Man, and all those superheroes are cool, but you know what? I really love real superheroes. So I went to the biography section looking for a superhero, and look who I found, Harriet Tubman. And she was a real superhero on our earth. And this is really cool because it is actually a graphic novel about a real superhero. It's a biography graphic novel, and I love all things graphic novel. Isn't that interesting how all of this I was leading up to and thinking about, all because I started reading the first chapter of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This book and this book and this book and this book are all available in our library at our KFC display. Come check them out. KFC got me thinking about reading.